David, hello. How are we?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No, thanks for coming on. I think my first question is, in the modern world, it's more difficult to draw conclusions to why somebody studied one thing at university as to what they follow up doing next. I studied theology and religion and now work in health and fitness. You studied mathematics, yet are fascinated with expectations. So does that come from a place of mathematical, analytical understanding, or are they separate things entirely?
Yeah, no, they are interconnected. So, like when I was at school, I really loved both like literature and creative writing and the sciences. And so I ended up kind of going down one path with mathematics, where I specialized in studying kind of statistics, interpreting medical data. But once I finished my degree, I kind of really wanted to kind of get back into the writing side of things. So becoming a science writer just seemed like a natural fit. And from there, I started specializing in psychology and neuroscience and the way that they kind of interface with medicine in particular and, well-being in general, through jobs at New Scientist and the BBC. And, in all of this time, I really started to notice there was a lot of research on the power of expectations and how we can often create self-fulfilling prophecies. And that's most obvious in medicine with the placebo effect, which is very well known and well studied. And it's really, we design all medical trials to try to account for that. But what I started to notice was that there's a lot of new research showing that expectations can influence all areas of life. So how you respond to exercise or your diet or how you deal with stress. So that really became a story that I wanted to explore in a lot more detail.
The irony of what I opened with is not going to be lost on me here. But the thing that really reaffirms the fascination that you have with expectations in the same way that I do, and why I'm so keen to have this conversation, is with the difference in life expectancy and pain tolerance in quality of life that comes from religious people versus non-religious people because of that faith. So I say the irony because I barely utilised my degree since I left university, and there I go, using it amidst this conversation. But it's a very, very interesting world. So how did you begin exploring it, and what were your initial discoveries?
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, like you said, that, you look at religious people and they do live longer. And that could be partly down to, their conscientiousness, like religions do tend to encourage exaggerated kind of behavior like drinking or drug taking or, eating to excess even. So, but yeah, it does seem that the element of faith can in itself explain some of the variance that you have in life expectancy. So all of this does show that, the effects of our expectations and beliefs can be profound. From my perspective, I really did start going into the scientific literature on the placebo effect to understand the mechanisms behind the power of expectations. And what we can see there is that even though, subjectively you might feel better just believing that you're having a medical treatment, even if it's this kind of inert sugar pill, what we can see is that you also do experience some objective changes to physiology that can't be discounted. And this has been best studied in explorations of analgesics, so painkillers. And what we find is that the brain, when we believe we're taking a painkiller, it often starts to produce its own opioid chemicals. So we call them endogenous opioids. And endogenous means that they're created by the body. That provides this pain relief that we wouldn't experience without the release of those opioids. And we know that because you can give people a placebo and surreptitiously also give them a chemical that blocks opioid signaling in the brain. And what you find is that those people, despite believing, despite having all the same conditions as those in the standard placebo condition, they don't experience the pain relief anymore. So it's not just kind of wishful thinking. They're not just reporting what they think the doctors want to hear. We can actually see there's a physiological mechanism there, this kind of bridge between the beliefs and the effects on their symptoms. And we see that then with lots of other placebo effects. So we know that our beliefs about a medical treatment can do things like change levels of inflammation within the body, and inflammation is often the cause of our discomfort with lots of illnesses. Can change things like blood pressure, the actions of your digestive system, the actions of your cardiovascular system, your nervous system. So, all of this is happening through this interface between the mind and the body.
And if the science wasn't there to support it, it would be easy to be cynical about these things, wouldn't it?
I
think that's what's most incredible.
That's it. I mean, I wouldn't have written this book if there wasn't science behind it, because, I'm all about having a really good, solid evidence base. And that's what this science is doing. And it's powerful because we have lots of different strands of evidence. So you have, on the one hand, kind of observational studies that might be looking at those correlations between long life and belief in religious people. But then you also have these experiments in the laboratory that are very carefully controlled. And you also have these experiments looking at these specific mechanisms behind the effects that we see. And when they're all pointing in the same direction, then that becomes much more convincing.
It really is. And I think that the placebo effect being as well reinforced as it is validates a lot of things that'd be quite easy to dismiss as woo-woo or unreinforced. And I can imagine that's where you learnt an awful lot along the way by analysing the research. Was there any cynicism that you had in yourself going on this journey, or had you seen the evidence beforehand to decide, no, this is something I fully believe in, and hence the book?
Yeah, I mean, I started collecting a lot of the evidence, in this big kind of folder where I'd kind of, any time I noticed a paper that was interesting, I would note down the reference, and, it became a document of like about 500 papers. So I knew there was a lot of research that was being published in good journals that was supporting the idea that the expectation effect exists, that it can have this power. But I approached each one with a certain skepticism, because that's really important. And so I didn't include every study that I came across that seemed to support my argument, because some of them, when I analysed the data myself and I looked at, how they were drawing their conclusions, I just didn't feel that they were strong enough to be included. So I did have like lots of different criteria. They had to be statistically significant results with large sample sizes in general. Ideally, they would be replicated in different populations. I was really very careful to only include the results that I felt were most robust and stood up to the highest level of scrutiny.
We'll come back to expectations, but a lot of what you said there, I guess, very much ties in with book number 1, which is that you clearly demonstrated yourself to be very analytical and intelligent within that context by not just taking the abstract and the summary of the study at face value, as it's easy to do with a quick PubMed search. And book number 1, The Intelligence Trap, which is something we've probably all experienced at one point in our lives, where we know somebody hyper-intelligent or hyper-educated that may be a little bit more susceptible to making mistakes that we can't comprehend. And you explored exactly why that was in detail, didn't you?
Right, exactly. Because I was really inspired by these kind of Nobel Prize winners who would then, kind of fall for scams or, believe in these kind of very shaky beliefs that just didn't seem to stand up to any kind of logical scrutiny. So one of the kind of prime examples was this guy called Kary Mullis, who discovered the PCR reaction, which is it's useful for amplifying small bits of genetic material, which is how we use it in lots of medical testing, including the COVID tests that we would have to send off to hospitals to analyze during the pandemic. And there's no doubting the kind of genius in him discovering this reaction. But then he also believed in a load of things that just do not stand up to scientific scrutiny. So he denied the link between HIV and AIDS, for example, and that is something that I think has been proven so robustly by now. But he was really going against the scientific consensus, and he was just wrong about that. I mean, you still get AIDS denialists who will disagree with me, but those people are at the absolute fringes of the scientific community. If we take logical deduction and the scientific method seriously, we have to disagree with Kary Mullis there. And there were lots of other beliefs he had. He denied that CFCs cause global warming, and he believed in that astrology was more robust than psychology for understanding the human mind. So clearly there was this enigma, like how could you be so clever and so stupid? And I just really wanted to understand that.
What were the overarching conclusions? Because we've all met, maybe we haven't, I don't know. I've definitely met people that are hyper intelligent, but equally, it's common sense tends to be where there's sometimes lacking, isn't there? So I guess I've always wondered if there's a danger of hyper specialization and there's diminishing returns beyond the point where maybe your brain just runs out of RAM or processing power to take in other things. I don't know. So what were the conclusions?
I mean, so there is a German concept for what you described, that hyper specialization. They call it, apologies for my pronunciation, but Fachidiot, which is someone who is so kind of narrowly specialized that they just can't see beyond the boundaries of their very particular discipline. And I love that concept. But the more general conclusions, firstly, it was that we are all susceptible to cognitive biases. So things like confirmation bias, anchoring effects, all of these things that Daniel Kahneman had looked at, where we don't necessarily, we tend to go with our kind of gut instincts, our hunches, rather than thinking about things very deliberatively and analytically. And what the research showed there was that our susceptibility to these biases, so our kind of broad irrationality, so the susceptibility to irrational biases, that doesn't really correlate as strongly as we would like with measures of intelligence or with academic success. So you have easily enough variation that you can have someone who scores brilliantly in academic exams, but they don't apply that intelligence to thinking, to thinking through problems carefully in real life. At least when they're not told to do so in a particular way. So we called that dysrationalia. It's a well-studied and well-established phenomenon now. And now the second means that by which smart people can act stupidly is when maybe they've suffered from dysrationalia to form this kind of very strong emotional belief about something. So they have that very strong instinct. But then, rather than applying their intelligence to interrogate that belief, they actually just use their intelligence to justify that belief. And so we do see that with lots of politically contentious issues, that actually you see greater polarization with greater levels of knowledge or intelligence. And that seems to be because people are just knuckling down. They're not really trying to kind of weigh up the different sides of the conflict and to come to some kind of compromised position, but they are coming to diametrically opposed positions because they have become attached to a certain belief, and then they're just using their intelligence to justify it, to knock down any evidence that might contradict their point of view, to find holes in that in ways that aren't rational. So the rational thing would always be to try to analyze all evidence equally, depending on its merits and irrespective of the conclusion that it draws to. But people, when they suffer from this motivated reasoning, they're not doing that. And in my book, I give some examples of famous cases of this, like Arthur Conan Doyle, clearly understood logical deduction in his Sherlock Holmes books, but then he believed in a whole load of like hoaxes and, like the Cottingley fairies scandal, where like these schoolgirls created pictures of fairies and then stuck them around their garden, took photos, and claimed they'd seen this kind of paranormal entity. Loads of other skeptics could see that, you could actually notice like where the thumbtacks were in the pictures, so it was obvious they were made of cardboard. But Arthur Conan Doyle just always found a way to discount all of those other arguments against them, and he absolutely fell for it hook, line, and sinker.
Is it a conscious decision is it a conscious decision, or is it arrogance? Unconscious, it would be more understandable, but consciously believing that your intelligence means that your opinion on something must therefore be inherently more right than somebody else. Is there a thread of DNA that runs through the dysrationalia where it's conscious or unconscious? Because they're two very different things from a human point of view, aren't they?
That's it. I mean, I get the feeling that, and I think this is supported by the research, that when they have come to their initial conclusion, that's very much kind of unconsciously driven. It's very emotional. They're not deliberately coming to the wrong conclusion there. But then you do have these other factors. So the rationalization that they're using in this motivated reasoning, that is very conscious. And actually, they could consciously decide, to try to think about the evidence more fairly, but they're so attached to the belief they kind of push it to one side. There are other phenomena like earned dogmatism. And that's very much like you're saying. It's like we feel that we've earned our credentials, maybe with our great success in one field, like Kerry Mullis with discovering the PCR and becoming a Nobel laureate, or Arthur Conan Doyle maybe with the great success of his books. And you kind of then think you don't need to go through the normal checks and balances that other people would to prove your point of view. You think you're already so smart, that your judgment is so great, that actually your intuitions are good enough. You don't need to think carefully about the evidence.
An example that came to mind is you saying that differentiates this, well, the mental versus the physical here, is if we look at somebody that's come from, I mean, for myself, for example, I came from years and years of rugby playing into a strength background. I was objectively strong, measurably strong. I then started doing aerobic work where I wasn't all that fit because I hadn't done much aerobic work, but I could have objectively said, I am a high-performing strength athlete, therefore, by logic, because I've got those credentials, I'll just be able to do this. It's a simpler skill. But I'm very quickly given evidence that that was wrong, and in fact there was work to be done and credentials to be earned in this separate thing, which is empirical, but you don't get that with mental stuff because you can form your own opinions and then die on that hill, I guess, can't you? So I think it's the lack of immediate feedback that tells you, no, Arthur, those are cardboard, and you can't deny this, that's probably missing, which is where I guess this can then feed into other things. Like the example you gave earlier, where there were lots of different things that were believed in. The PCR test, yes, yeah. Credentials, fantastic. 3 hoaxes and things at the other end. You're like, well, hang on, how do we get here? Yeah. How do we get here? So it's because it's bordering on hubris in a way, isn't it? To think, well, because I'm clever in one thing, I therefore must be right in everything else. That in and of itself is very non-scientific and very open-minded in a way of thinking, and to come to new and radical conclusions, you have to be open-minded and open to new ways of thinking. So the irony is polar opposite.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, I think like when we look at people who are very good at this kind of decision-making and who do have very fine judgment, so people like the so-called super forecasters who are much more accurate than the average person, than random, than even some of the kind of people who are paid to do so. These super forecasters can predict the outcomes of world events very accurately. And what you find is that these people are always looking to update their opinions with new data. So they have a very open-minded approach. And that is what allows them to be so good at telling the future, is because, they will gather as much data as possible and they're not attached to any particular point of view. They will always be trying to weigh it up again each time something new comes through. And we just, we don't see that in a lot of people because of things like earned dogmatism.
So in the discussion we've had so far, we've explored expectations and the intelligence trap. So to blend those two, in a discussion I've been having a lot recently and something I've been reflecting on recently, and I'm sure you can, as you got into Cambridge. I didn't get into Oxford. I ended up at Durham, shock. And I've been thinking about this a lot, which is the value of university in terms of intelligence acquired versus critical thinking outside of that setting, potentially lost in the modern world. So in your opinion, based on the conclusions that you've drawn, is there as much merit in university education as there once was?
Yeah, so I don't have good data to kind of compare how people performed in the past. And the data that I have seen from, say, like the 1980s actually does suggest that, even then, university education was not so great at training the critical thinking skills that would help us to escape the intelligence trap, which is not to discount the huge importance of all of the factual knowledge that we can learn at university and all of those other skills, the curiosity that it can bring. I think it is incredibly important. But I think what has really fallen by the wayside in most education systems is critical thinking, which we have assumed just kind of comes naturally as part of our studies. But that's just not necessarily the case. And actually, if you look at a lot of subjects, what happens is that you really are rewarded for building a very strong and convincing case for your argument. And that's almost like just training those rationalization and justification skills that can actually help you with your motivated reasoning, can actually just, help you to justify what you believe and to kind of knock down the arguments that stand in your way. So it's not necessarily teaching us to be intellectually humble, to be intellectually honest, to do this more balanced reasoning that you would want. And we do see that in measures of critical thinking. They don't increase as much as we would want throughout university. So I do think, university education, school education, all of these could be better to incorporate these other important skills. What the research suggests, actually, when you do have these university courses, say in history, that teach the normal curriculum alongside critical thinking, but they're just incorporating it into what the students are doing, is that actually they complement each other. Like, people who learn critical thinking in their history courses end up learning the historical facts much better as well. They have a deeper understanding of what's going on, because it's actually much more engaging to be really interrogating sources in this way, rather than to be kind of coming up with your argument and then doing this post hoc justification.
So do you think qualifications matter as much as they once did? Or does that come with some sort of credibility bias or potentially dogmatism that could have downstream negative effects?
Yeah, there's definitely a danger, but I think, there is a danger of that, but I do also think, like, for lots of professions, it's obviously really important that you get the best education that you can, and then that is tested correctly. You wouldn't want to be you wouldn't want to be treated by a doctor who hasn't been through medical school, or to employ a lawyer who hasn't been to law school. But so it's not, I'm certainly not against education. I just think it should be adapted to include this new understanding of human psychology and of the traps that we can face. And I think that would be better for society as a whole if, and you could incorporate these in, at much younger ages too, but then it could still remain important within degree courses. And I think then we would maybe see less political polarization than we do now, less susceptibility to misinformation. All of these things are so important.
The reason I ask, I think, is because my expectations of university versus the experience that I had in terms of the self-development and exposure to open-mindedness were very mismatched. And that wasn't good for me, because I left. I came to university full of expectation, life and ambition, and found that first year was kind of nothing. Second and third year, the modules that I had available to me weren't really stimulating the parts of my brain that I was interested in. So it then just became a bit of a game of ticking boxes for the sake of a piece of paper. Granted, I wasn't doing a vocational degree, which is where the lawyer and the doctor example, I think, is very much where my opinion lands, which is vocational stuff needs to be tested correctly and in that pathway. But I think for something that's more curiosity, critical thinking, forming an argument driven like my degree was, I just think the stuff around the fringes that really encouraged you to think openly wasn't there. And I think that actually meant that there was a bit of a delay in me learning those things in the years that followed university. Paid a lot of money for the privilege, and I think it was just the rate of development that was there for me to have versus the rate of development that occurred was mismatched due to the potential lack of exposure to that I had at university, whilst my expectations were that I would have that. So it's something I'm constantly reflecting on. And maybe I should just better manage my expectations.
No, I'm totally in agreement with you there. And that's what I think more and more people who are studying critical thinking are coming to this conclusion, that actually, in degrees like, studying like theology and religion and philosophy, that provides ample opportunities to be practicing critical thinking. And if universities are not providing that, then they're really doing a disservice to their students.
Agreed. And I think that's where, for me personally, a lot of the downstream effects of that were with connections with peers, connections with myself, my own ambition, and how I spent my time. I became depressed. I attempted suicide in 2016. I had a very, very negative experience with the outcome of that mismatch in expectations, which very much feeds into your more recent book. And I'd love to start by asking whether you agree or disagree with Johan Hari's take on things, because he's been on the podcast. in terms of the lack of connection being one of the biggest contributing factors to the mental health and well-being challenges that we face in the modern world? Or do you view it as more complex?
Yeah, I probably do view it as being a little more complex, but I do think he's right that the social connection is so fundamentally important to health and well-being, mental health and physical health. And again, I think this is one of these areas of life that we kind of take it for granted, that people just grow up able to form good connections with people. And if you don't, well, it's like tough luck. There's something wrong with you as an individual for not doing that. People might not put it so harshly, but I think ultimately that was the way it was seen in my kind of, in my experience at school, for example, that it was, you might have like PSHE lessons, which were, trying to teach you those kind of soft skills, but they were not taken seriously by the teachers or the students, and they weren't really actually very well designed as a curriculum to enable you to deal with those real challenges that you face in life. Like, what do you do when you're lonely? How can you build friends when you move to a new city and you don't know anyone? Or, what do you do when you feel that you failed and you're being overly critical for that? Like, how can you learn self-compassion? These are the things that I think we should be taught in schools, and we're not being taught them. So yeah, I do agree with that, and I do think like Johan really did center on one of the important factors for mental health that is just being, or had historically been, neglected. I think people now are, people are coming to the conclusion that connection really matters, and we do see now that the World Health Organization, for example, has a special commission that's trying to raise awareness of this issue. But until the last couple of years, I think it had very much been, something you might read about in the wellness like supplements of magazines, but it wasn't really being taken so seriously by the medical profession.
Do you think the pandemic has had anything to do with bringing that to the forefront of the public, and therefore the snowball effect that's come from research studies, discussion on, or do you think it was just a matter of time?
Yeah, no, I do think it was important. I mean, I think at the same time, the research has reached this kind of critical mass, which is why I started writing my book, because, we have seen like huge meta-analyses now. So a meta-analysis, when you have, researchers don't just look at the results from one study, but they gather together all the available evidence today over hundreds of studies, and they check, how robust that research has been, what are the overall conclusions. They use rigorous statistical analyses to kind of try to come up with this average effect size. And what the research had shown in the last 10 years when they started to do these meta-analyses is that social connection is as important to our health as behaviours like diet, exercise, how much you drink, even whether or not you smoke. So there had been this kind of critical mass of evidence, but then I think to actually get people to take action, I do think the pandemic was fundamental for that, because suddenly we were feeling much more isolated, and it became like a major social issue that was occupying everyone's minds, and so that really pushed people into taking action.
What is the fast friendship procedure?
Okay, so this is something that we can all try to apply to build connections more quickly. And it's based on the philosophy of having greater self-disclosure. So that is just going deeper than you normally would in a conversation to talk about the things that really matter to you. So stuff that you might have a tendency to hide because you think other people might not be interested in hearing it, or because they make you feel a bit vulnerable. So your hopes, your dreams, your anxieties, your fears, your core values, all of these are the things that we could talk about with greater self-disclosure. And what this research does, which it started in the 1990s, and again it's been replicated many times, is the scientists just gave people 36 conversational prompts that would encourage them to talk about those things with a random acquaintance, so totally new person, a stranger. For over 45 minutes, they would discuss some of these 36 questions. And they could range from, if your house was burning down and you'd already saved all of your family and pets, what one item would you go back inside to recover? And that's getting people to talk about some object of real sentimental value that will have like a very powerful memory attached to it. Or you would ask, if you could live to 90 with the body of a 30-year-old or the mind of a 30-year-old, what would you choose to preserve? And that, again, I think is telling you something important about what people are prioritizing in their life. How do they feel about themselves? What's more important, aesthetics and beauty or intellectual capacity? Something that we might feel embarrassed to give our answer, but people connect well when they talk about that. Finally, a question would be like, what topic of conversation is so sacred that it cannot be joked about? And that's really getting people to talk about the things that, really the kind of subjects that tie into their core values. And again, something that we might feel embarrassed to talk about those things because we think other people won't share the same things that we do, and that feels painful. But what the researchers found was that despite dreading the fast friendship procedure at the beginning of the exercise and really thinking it was going to be quite excruciating, by the end people really enjoyed it, and more importantly, it really did accelerate their intimacy that they had achieved. So when they were questioned, their emotional closeness to these new acquaintances often equaled their closeness to some of their oldest friends. So it really had, condensed the formation of a friendship into a 45-minute period.
Do you think there is a potential barrier to entry for the efficacy of that, given that I've met a lot of people? I think there's a real problem in the modern world with people not actually even able to comprehend to themselves in their own private time those deeper thoughts, those real deeper questions about themselves, what actually is important to them, what are their priorities? Because a lot of the time we're fed a very linear narrative of how we should exist in the UK, in the States, predictable capitalist seems to be the common thread here. Countries whereby we are told to do this, told to do that, then you do that, then you get promoted, then you go on that holiday, then you get this car, you get that, all that, and we kind of fed this worldview which we then mold ourselves into. And I think a lot of people are only really starting to think about, well, actually, that worldview doesn't really get me as far as it once did. What do I actually want from life? So I don't know if it was in the study itself because I've not read it, but in your findings with the book, do you think there is a certain level of self-awareness that would be required for that exercise to be as effective as it would be for others? Or do you think that simple, on-the-spot exploration of open-mindedness, rather, will bring out the best in a person at whatever level they're at?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question that wasn't covered in any of the studies. So I don't have good data on that. I would say, there was variation between participants. I'm sure there were some who did not gain as much out of that as possible. And I think we've all met people who maybe, it wouldn't matter if you spoke about these things for, a whole day. You're maybe not going to you're not going to be able to kind of break through. And I do think that what you say, about our kind of societal values, I do think there's going to be, in my opinion, it's going to be quite a small subset of people who just haven't engaged in that introspection enough to be able to talk about those things. They might turn their mind away from it even because sometimes even admitting these things to yourself can be uncomfortable. So I do think you're right there. But I would say, from what you see in these studies is that it does seem to be effective for the majority of the people, and that gives me hope. So I do think lots of people are thinking about these things. Now, I think our societal expectations might prevent us from talking about them because they just don't seem to be what is really valued in our society. So people are keeping them private. And what I want my book to do and what the awareness of this research to do is really to get people to feel more comfortable about talking about those things because, people do care much more than you think, and they're not going to feel awkward or embarrassed by you talking about them. Most people will actually become very engaged with you, and they will, when you talk about these things, they might feel freer to talk about them themselves, where they had once been too embarrassed to discuss, those deep values. So that's what I think we all need to be a little bit braver. And that was really the conclusion that I got from not just the fast friendship procedure, but from so much of the research, is that actually we often self-sabotage, we often hold ourselves back needlessly, and actually other people are much more open and welcoming to us than we would expect if we only do have the courage to breach those boundaries.
Do introverts and extroverts have the same social connection challenges to overcome at their core, and therefore the methods of achieving them are different? Or do they have different challenges that they need to overcome in the modern world, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I would say they're more similar than we would expect. So there are studies looking at both, groups that include both introverts and extroverts that have just encouraged them to be a bit more social. So to talk to more strangers, for example. And what you find is that both groups, anyone on that spectrum benefits from being more social. So that suggests to me that actually extroverts, despite seeming more confident, maybe do have this kind of reserve that we don't give them credit for. That actually maybe they are holding themselves back, just maybe not as much as the introverts. And I think it shows to me that the introverts, seem to have more negative expectations of how those conversations are going to go than the extroverts. But everyone basically is a bit nervous about talking to a stranger because they think it's going to be awkward. And then what they find is that actually, you practice it regularly and you find that people just are nicer than you expect, and that the interactions are less awkward than you expect and more pleasurable. So those are the similarities. I think it's more a matter of degree than a kind of difference in kind of the problems that they face. But we do see some differences too, and it's not always the case that extroverts have an advantage. So, for example, when it comes to deep conversations, the kind that we spoke about with the fast friendship procedure, introverts tend to be considered to be better listeners than extroverts. So they might actually get a more positive response than an extrovert when you're talking about these things that really matter, because an extrovert's kind of tendency might always be to be kind of ebullient and enthusiastic, but sometimes that can seem quite fake. And then people kind of pull back because of that. They don't trust that the interest is genuine. Whereas if you have an introvert sitting in front of you who's very focused on what you're saying and thinking very carefully about what you're saying, then that feels more genuine and actually engenders closer connection quicker.
It's very interesting that you say all of that, but one thing to focus on especially is the just the ability to start conversation with strangers. When I was recovering with my own mental well-being at a personal level, I can't remember what website. I was actually having this conversation over the weekend, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember what website it was that I read it on, but it was something called Elderly Talk, which was if you can have a conversation for a minute or more with a stranger, even if it's about things that you think are a little bit dull, like the weather or the price of avocados or whatever it might be, just boring things that aren't going to make you more attractive, aren't going to make you more interesting. It's just top-line information. But if you can start a conversation with a stranger and hold it for more than a minute, you are in the 99. You're in the 1% of people they will have ever had an interaction with by being able to do so, and that they can then pull more out of them because they then feel comfortable. It then pulls more out of you, and then you can move away from the quote unquote elderly talk into a deeper, more specific conversation. And I just tasked myself with having a conversation with cashiers or baristas or something when I was feeling very socially disconnected, and the aggressive fast track in my return to confidence and ability to have a conversation with people that comes from that was enormous. And it disempowers that entirely at the back end of it, which is great, which means that I'm not afraid to talk to anyone about anything really, which is great because it means I can be much more honest with myself first and foremost. So I think the connective side of things is there are a lot of people out there that might feel that they've got nobody they can connect with, or might not have access to the ability to even have these conversations or put themselves in situations where they can tackle this. So you labeled 13 strategies for social connection. Are there any that are most specific to those that might feel like they don't have access to them rather than they are not utilizing them?
Yep. Absolutely. And I think, the first few chapters really deal with this. So fundamentally, I think it's it's very much like you said, that our social skills come with practice and social confidence comes with practice. And so we do have to show some courage when we first start having these conversations. But the good news is that the social confidence that we crave can come very rapidly once we start that. So there was a study of, these were kind of healthy participants. They weren't people suffering from mental illnesses, but they were like they had the average levels of loneliness, which is quite high for the general population still. And they were given this app. There was this kind of scavenger hunt where they were told given certain goals each day to pick from, to just talk to a different person in their day-to-day routine, and they would get points for the more people they spoke to. And so it could be like find someone who's got a cute pet and talk to them about that pet, or talk to your barista, or talk to someone who is wearing amazing clothes, or who's doing something creative. Then you can talk about their project. And at the start, people had all of these social inhibitions that are very normal. Like, we shouldn't feel ashamed of them, because most people do feel, to start with, they feel kind of awkward having those interactions. But what they found was that just after 5 days, that regular practice day by day had helped those pessimistic expectations to evaporate. So by that point, people were already starting to feel more positive about approaching people. They were looking forward to it rather than dreading it. They were expecting to have a good experience. And that to me really shows how important regular practice is. Now, I think what we have there shown in that study is also that these people had what we call implementation expectations. So it's not just the kind of intention to talk to more strangers, but it's actually having a specific plan for when you're going to do that. And you mentioned like you had this plan to kind of talk to cashiers or baristas. Well, I think that is really good. If you can make a list of like, these are the situations where I'm just going to do it. Like, even if I feel a bit nervous, I'm just going to make myself talk to them and start that conversation. What the research on behavioural change shows is that just having that concrete plan up front makes you much more likely to go ahead with it.
I gamified it a bit as well, in the sense that I actually started timers and tried to see how long I could make it last without it getting like not being.
Yeah,
I could still acknowledge when it was okay. This has run flat, but if you can just keep the momentum, then I'd count that on the timer.
Yeah.
And then that started to invert my expectation of quote unquote rejection because of my perception of who I was at the time. And over time, that inverted to a much more positive expectation as to conversations like this as a whole, which meant that I could then, important nuance based on the question I asked before, I had access to people that could have supported me or I could have had more of a social connection with, but chose out of shame and I guess a lack of confidence in the person I believe myself to be, I chose to not access them to help myself, which was a narrative on masculinity and things that I've explored in the podcast before and we won't do today, but it meant that I effectively felt like I had nobody available to me. And what allowed me to access the people that were actually available to me was rebuilding that confidence slowly but surely. So I think it's a very powerful thing. And I don't think you need to feel like you're in a bad place for that to have merit. I think it's just a skill that can be developed over time and is something I'll always endeavour to do to a point now. And I think it also makes you feel, it demystifies being, at risk of calling myself charming here, which isn't my intention, but it demystifies how do people have conversations with strangers? And then you realise that people aren't going to judge you and think you're a boring bastard for talking about the weather for a long time. Because if you can just speak to a stranger off the cuff, they'll remember that conversation because not many people can do that. So I think it takes away the power of how on earth can people be so confident, because it simplifies it. And I think that's a lot of what the challenges that we face are these days, is that things have become seemingly complex when in reality it's just the basics have become a little bit more murky.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, I totally agree with you. And, to add a couple of things to that, I also think it's important, like you say, it's like having those conversations with strangers can actually make you more confident in talking to people who are already in your life as well. So, you might be putting off contacting an old friend because you assume they're going to be pissed off with you or that they don't really want to hear from you anymore because so much time has passed. But actually, when you've had these interactions with someone, your barista, and you've seen that go really well, it makes you realize, it reminds you that actually, people are nicer than you think. It tells you that your expectations are often wrong and that, it's worth trying trying to challenge those expectations. And, you know, regarding the point about like overcomplicating things these days, that's exactly what all of this psychological research points to, is that we have become really hung up on feeling that we don't have the competence to have these interactions with other people. Like, we imagine you have to be incredibly like eloquent and smart and witty and charming, like you said, for people to want to talk to you. But when these scientists kind of question people after these conversations, and they're like, what did you most notice about that person? They're not judging someone on how on the content of the conversation specifically. Like, they're not really thinking, oh, he, you know, mumbled a word or kind of repeated himself, or, you know, like, what they're really focusing on is, how warm did you see? How did you make them feel? Did you seem interested? Did you seem friendly? And those are things that we can all cultivate. By just having the good intentions and wanting the other person to feel good, you know, that is enough in these interactions. We don't have to be really like proper smooth talkers to be effective.
I think business setting, work setting as well, it's all massive. If you can go into a conversation viewing the person on their side of the table or whatever it may be as a human being rather than an opposition or an intimidating whatever, then it makes it a lot less overwhelming, or potentially overwhelming. And I think that's the biggest lesson I accidentally learned from trying to make myself feel a little better on a day-to-day basis, is the value of that stuff beyond just short-term alleviation versus long-term gain. It was a real empirical experience for me, which I now try and do on my day-to-day basis. So that's a psychological level. However, there is a link between social connection and actual long-term physical health as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And I mean, you know, this was the link between like the expectation effect and the social, the laws of connection. In that the expectation effect had definitely built this case for this mind-body connection and showed how, you know, our beliefs can shape our physiology. And then what you see is that this also occurs when we feel, depending on how we feel socially. So whether we feel excluded or whether we feel understood and supported by other people. And you know, again, this is very robust research. And what all of these studies show, mechanistic studies, longitudinal studies, you know, with big cohorts of people, laboratory studies that, you know, prime people to feel excluded or connected, you know, what they all show us is that, you know, how we feel with other people can influence our health, both in the short term and the long term. So in the long term, we see that people with greater social connections, so either more connections but also more feelings of being supported and understood, that those people are less likely to die overall, and they're less susceptible to a range of different illnesses, from catching an infection like the common cold to developing Alzheimer's, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, to have a heart attack and to die from a heart attack, you know, or to have a stroke and die from a stroke. You know, all of these things are connected to social connection. And we know basically what's happening is that when you feel isolated, the body is preparing itself for a physical threat, because in prehistory, if you were kicked out of your group, you'd have been a much greater danger of being attacked by a predator, for example. So it starts doing things like raising inflammation in your body. Now, inflammation is good for protecting you from immediate infection, bacterial infection within your wounds, and helping to, you know, your blood to clot more quickly so that you don't bleed to death. But in the long term, inflammation at high levels can contribute to a diminished immune system in general, but also to wear and tear on your tissues, whether that's your pancreas or your heart or your brain. And so the heightened inflammation is that missing link here that can explain why social connection has such an impact on physical health.
So what are the lowest hanging fruits for people to endeavour to work into their day-to-day life to create more social connections? Because it's difficult in the modern world, isn't it? We're becoming more and more busy. Money's going less and less far, which means that leisure pursuits of days gone by maybe aren't as accessible as they once were. Do you believe that there are easy things that people can access that we're not doing that will make them feel better, and, I guess, not to be dramatic, can add years to their life?
Yeah, definitely. There's loads. I mean, I do think like just paying a bit more attention to those kind of interactions that we've spoken about. So, when you're buying your coffee, just actually making conversation with the barista rather than just kind of thrusting your card in their face. Those are kinds of things that we can all do that are not going to cost us money or time, but they're just helping us to feel a bit more connected to the people around us. Similarly, we tend to be overly pessimistic about connecting with people who we haven't spoken to in a while, so those old friends. But actually the research shows, people appreciate hearing from us much more than we would recognize. And so rather than feeling kind of this lingering loneliness and that anxiety about not having been in touch with those people, just pick up your phone. You could do it after you finish listening to this podcast. Just think of an old friend, send them a very quick message just saying that they're in your thoughts, that you'd like to meet up, or that you just want to check in on them and see how they're doing. That kind of thing can be very powerful. It's an instant benefit to us. In our day-to-day interactions, with our colleagues, with our kind of existing friends, with our family members, we can try to practice that self-disclosure that was important in the fast friendship procedure. So just being a bit more open with other people. We can be more open both about our vulnerabilities, but also our successes. So that's what the research shows us, is that, we simultaneously will hide things that we think make us feel weak, but we'll also hide the things that we feel proud of, because we're so worried about rejection in both cases. And actually, those are unfounded fears. Like, most people are just, they want to know those things that are worrying you because they want to help, they want to give you support, and they want to hear about the things that make you happy and proud, because that can help them to feel vicarious happiness and pride, and they enjoy that feeling. They're less likely to feel envious than we expect. So, all of this is very positive, I think, in terms of just making us feel a bit easier about the interactions that we're having with people. I'll say just the one final thing that you can do that, again, is very simple and is likely to go down very well, and that is just to pay more compliments, show more gratitude. Again, we have these psychological barriers that mean that we tend to worry about giving a compliment because we think it might seem a bit unctuous, or that we'll say it kind of inelegantly and someone will not appreciate that will be too clumsy, but it's unfounded. Though those fears just don't really play any part in the interaction. People just really acknowledge and welcome the warmth that you're showing there. So you don't need to bite back those positive things. If you think it about someone, whether it's a stranger, whether it's about, your closest friend or anyone in between, just say it. And that will strengthen the friendship, and it will make you both feel good. So you'll feel better for having said the compliment, and the other person will feel better to have heard it. And it's so easy, but it's just something that we don't do naturally because we are too inhibited.
Americans are a lot better at those things than Brits, actually, aren't they, in many ways? Jamie and I, my brother, who's behind the camera right now, we were running in America and just found that people mowing their garden would be like, "Looking good, boys." And we're like, "What? Excuse me? How dare you talk to us mid doing something?" And I'm like, "Well, actually, this was a perfectly pleasant interaction. He had good intentions. It just shocked us in a way because we're not used to it. It wasn't an insult. It was, in fact, the opposite. But we were like, what? Is there an ulterior motive here? What's happening? Because it's just so rare in the modern world. And I think as well, not shouting about strengths, emphasizing weaknesses, self-deprecation, all quite British. I wonder if it all just stems back to sunlight ultimately. But no, I think a lot of those things, there's a lot more in our control than we give ourselves credit for. And I think there's a lot of learned behaviors that we can work against that will help with this stuff massively, aren't there?
Yeah,
so,
totally.
Strategies for expectations in the modern world. What are the lowest hanging fruit strategies that people can work in to better manage their expectations or to get more out of their expectations?
Okay, so I think what I really discovered with the expectation effect was that, I guess it's related to what we've spoken about. People are just reflexively pessimistic, and we often see it as being a way of kind of managing our expectations. So we think we're kind of being smarter by being cynical, but that is not the case. Often we are just needlessly pessimistic, and there is nothing smart about being that. You're no smarter having like doom-laden expectations than you would be from having like these super sunny kind of Pollyanna-ish positive expectations either. Neither of them are calibrated to reality. And so I think what I really advocate for is just to try to stay open-minded. If you notice yourself always thinking about the negative scenario, like the worst case scenario, and you start catastrophizing events, just try to ask yourself, like, is there really good evidence for that to happen? Or am I amplifying these fears? And am I exaggerating the fears? And what would be another more positive interpretation of that event? Or is there something more positive that could come out of this that is equally likely that I'm just not considering? So that's the kind of general message of the expectation effect. But actually then there are lots of specific examples, and just the one that I found personally most transformative for me was just looking at stress. Our culture makes us think that stress is inherently bad and that it's going to lead to failure. And what the research shows is that often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those negative expectations actually amplify the stress response to the point that we are more likely to fail, and that is going to cause more damage to our physical and mental health. Whereas if we try to think of stresses as being of the kind of feeling of nerves before an important event like an exam or a speech, if we think about those nerves as being empowering and recognize that the stress response is adaptive and evolved to help us to boost our performance, what you find is that becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. And actually it just helps to kind of defang the toxicity of your worries, so that actually you do end up feeling more energized, but you're better able to respond to the specific challenges of the situation.
My favorite little mindset shift with that is imposter syndrome, in the sense that if the imposter syndrome becomes overwhelming and you really lean on the imposter side of things and that, I don't belong here, but flip it into the reality that you have essentially leveled up, and therefore it's completely logical to feel out your depth, under stress, exposed and vulnerable, because you're in a period of growth. And like any period of growth, there needs to be an acclimatization, there needs to be time, there needs to be learnings, there needs to be support, there needs to be social connection, there needs to be all the things that we've discussed today. So either A, are you happy staying exactly where you are the rest of your life? If the answer is yes, then don't put yourself in any situations where you'll feel like an imposter. If the answer is B, no, then embrace the imposter syndrome, because it means that you're doing exactly what you wanted to be doing in the first place.
Right.
And I think that's a conversation I have quite a lot, because I'm quite comfortable under a lot of pressure that I can find myself in situations, but that's just due to reps over the years.
Yeah.
It's being in them enough times and knowing that I've just become comfortable. Pressure and stress is quite constant in my life at this point, so it feels weird when it's not there. But I've learned that if there's no pressure, there's no progress. And yes, there might be some people out there going, well, you can make X amount of money on this many hours a week doing this thing and all that sort of stuff. But I think for the most part, the only way that people can come to seamless ways of living is through many, many iterations of pressure equaling progress.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And, I quote Billie Jean King in my book. She said, pressure is privilege. And she said that specifically not about the tennis matches, but about the speeches that she would have to make when she won a tennis match. And for a small part of her career, she felt so nervous about public speaking that she was tempted to actually throw the matches, to fail deliberately so she wouldn't have to talk. And then she realised, like you said, it was a period of growth for her. It was a possibility for her to learn something new, and actually it was a great privilege to be in that position, that so many other competitors would have done anything they could to be able to give that speech. And that's what I think, I certainly don't think, all stress is equal. Like some stresses that we face, like grief, anxiety about finances or our health, I don't think, I'm not trying to say that they're all equally good for us, but often we feel stressed about situations that we have chosen to put ourselves in because we do want to grow. We don't want to stay stagnant. We want to improve. And I think just recognizing that fact, and then recognizing that the stress we feel in those situations can actually be empowering, that, that can be very transformative to just make that realization.
Fantastic. David, thank you very much. That has been a very thorough debrief of all three of your books, and lots of things that have intertwined quite nicely, much more neatly than I anticipated in my planning, in fact. So I'm glad that we've gone down that road. Where is the best place for people to find more information about what you're up to, and most importantly, buy your books? Do you have a preferred vendor?
Cool. Well, first of all, thanks so much for your curiosity and for handling the conversation so well and leading me for all these different paths. So you can find me on Instagram, David A. Robson, Twitter, D_A_Robson. My website, where I have my portfolio and more information about my books, is davidrobson.me. You should be able to find my book, from any of the usual booksellers that you would use. Amazon is often convenient, but if you do prefer to use independent bookshops, I think that's always appreciated. Something like bookshop.org, the website, can be a good way for you to support independent bookshops. But basically, wherever you would normally buy your books.
What's your favourite?
My favourite? I do really like...
Is that like asking you to say your favourite child? Is that unfair?
It is, yeah. I'm worried that I'll offend people with whoever I choose. No, I love bookshop.org, hive.co.uk have been very supportive as well. Those are my two main ones, I guess, in the UK.
And if there's a book that you think is most relevant to individuals in the modern world from you, which would it be?
One of my books or one from... Okay. Yeah. No, this really is like picking
I just leveled up the question there.
Yeah. You
answered too quickly, so I thought, let's create some imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Tough one. The expectation effect I'm very fond of, and I do think that's a great introduction to some of these ideas. So maybe that would then be a good place for people to start before they go on to the laws of connection. But it really depends kind of what your particular kind of challenges in your life are. If you're feeling lonely, if you want to kind of build your relationships with people, whether you're dating, whether you want to have better connections with your colleagues, whether it's a family problem, the laws of connection would be for you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again. All the best for your holiday on Wednesday. And very much enjoyed the conversation.
Cool. Thank you. It has been a pleasure.